When we talk about where the European relationship comes in, and in actual fact, EASA, which is the European Aviation Safety Agency, formally established in 2002. It took over from these guys, the Joint Aviation Authority, the JAA. The JAA was a big step forward, because before the JAA, each one country was on its own in Europe. And Europe is composed of many small countries, some very small countries. And what was happening, whilst the European aviation was basically competing with each other, the Americans were clearing the room. They were doing everything. And so once the European aviation community started working together, you only have to see now the Airbus product that's competing with Boeing. It's every bit as good, and between them they're dominating the world stage. If Airbus had not been created, we would still just be Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, and so on and so on. These guys would have all kept going. It was the Airbus product that has balanced the equation. And of course, the big advantage is it keeps the costs relative. Because if there is no competition, you can set your price. If there is a competition, then you have to develop your price. The JAA started at the beginning of the 1970s, and they spent 20 years focused on the management of the design product. And they harmonized, the relationship with the FAA was harmonized with the JAA, so that they have the same code of oversight processes. For example, if we're looking at the aeroplane, the FAA requirement will be found in FAR 25, FAR 25. Under the JAA, the same requirement would be found in JAR 25, JAR 25. Same. Slight differences, but substantially the same. With the adoption by EASA, the term JAR has gone and been replaced with CS. So you will now see CS 25, Certification Specification 25, which is still aligned with FAR 25. So that was 20 years, up until the 1990s. At the beginning of the 1990s, JAR 145 was introduced. And JAR 145, of course, was harmonized with the FAA, FAR 145. And so when we look at 145 today, it's heading towards 25 years. So it's a very mature regulation. When we look at Part M, and of course we're understanding that the camo is working within the Part M environment, it only became law in 2006. It was introduced in 2003, became mandatory in 2006. So we're looking at a more recent set of regulations. We talk here about Annex II aeroplanes. What is Annex II aeroplanes? Well, basically aeroplanes which do not have a European type certificate are considered Annex II. And in actual fact, if I want to operate an Annex II aeroplane, I will not operate it under the guidance of EASA. I will operate it under the guidance of the national regulations, the national authority. So what we have then is an understanding that in each country, in Europe for example, each country, the regulator acts as a competent authority in respect of the compliance with EASA, and they also act as a national authority in respect of the obligation of the individual to comply with Annex II aeroplane oversight. Now, can I take an Annex II aeroplane and do commercial air transport? The answer is no. Unless it's an approved aeroplane and the type certificate is approved on EASA's website, and you cannot operate this aeroplane for commercial air transport. Can I operate it privately? For sure. Could a flying club operate it? Yes, they can. It's a different environment. Here we're looking at a structure that brings together EASA regulations. We can see at the very top we've got what we call the basic regulation. The basic regulation, and we look at this 216/2008, and this is the unique reference number to this regulation. The second number obviously refers to the year, and the first number refers to the unique number of that regulation. It's not a series of aviation regulations. 215 could belong to agriculture. 217 could belong to fisheries. It's just a number that's allocated. The thing that makes the basic regulation different is it's approved by the European Parliament. The European system is a little bit complicated. We have a European Commission. The European Commission is the boss of EASA, and then we have a European Parliament. The European Parliament is elected officials from each country, and we have a European Commission where commissioners are actually appointed by a country. So, the European Parliament approves the basic regulation, and then we have Commission regulation. And the Commission regulations describe the rules and regulations that we have to follow. Commission regulation is law. Basic regulation is law. But basic regulation is of a higher importance and is approved by the European Parliament. Commission regulation is still of huge importance, but the agreement is it's approved by the European Commission. There is a process. It's called comitology. They've invented a word based on the committee. It's a European committee which finally approves the EASA regulations. So EASA does not approve its own regulations. EASA issues a notice of proposed amendment, goes through a comment response process which we explain. Finally, it's adopted, it's accepted, and it's issued into European law. Binding in law, we must comply. Not binding in law. Do we have to comply? Of course. We still have to comply. However, as we've already said, in respect of acceptable means of compliance and guidance material, that we have an option to do something a little bit different. In general, the information is there within the AMC that we have to comply with. Established by the European Parliament and established by the European Commission.